Hi, this is Lee from the Law School Toolbox. I am so excited to have one of my dear friends from law school here, Hannah Siegel Proff, who is a private solo criminal defense lawyer out in Denver. And she is going to chat with us about a life as a criminal defense lawyer. And Hannah, I have done like 500 or plus episodes, and you're like the first law school friend who's been on it, which is really funny to me. I know. I had no idea.
You got to change that. I'm honored to be the first, but you have to change that. I want to see.
I know. I'm basically like need to go down my list and be like, who else wants to come join?
Especially now there's judges and all these partners at fancy law firms, so it's only uphill from here.
It is, really. I mean, we now seem way fancier than we were back in the day.
That's for sure.
Well, to get things kicked off for our listeners, can you share a little bit more about yourself and what you do?
Of course. So I'm happy to be here. I own and operate a boutique solo criminal and juvenile defense practice here in Denver, Colorado. And I've been practicing law for 16 years. I spent 7 years as a public defender. Then I was in policy for a while. Then I went to a private law firm. And now I've owned my own law firm for 6 years. So I really love running and operating a solo practice.
That's so cool. I mean, I remember you talking about your dreams about practicing criminal law back in law school, which we won't admit how many years ago that was to age ourselves. But how did you know that criminal law was going to be your passion? And was doing a practice like you've built always how you wanted to do it?
Well, I was a cradle to JD law student. I don't know that I actually recommend that when I teach now at both of the law schools here locally, and I'm always talking to similar cradle to JD folks, and I'm a little jealous of the people who had some more life experience before law school. But since I went into law school at the ripe old age of 21, 22, I thought I knew exactly what I wanted to do. And what I wanted to do was fight the prison industrial complex with a law degree. So at 22-year-old Hannah, what that meant to me at that moment was doing prisoners' rights, civil rights, that sort of work. But as soon as I was introduced to trial practice, that all changed. I fell in love with being in a courtroom and cross-examinations and the strategy and the theater of it all, and I was hooked. And so I parlayed my passion for fighting the criminal justice prison industrial complex, into direct representation and indigent defense specifically.
And what's been the most surprising thing about your role as a private criminal defense lawyer?
I think the most surprising thing has just been how much business is part of running a law firm, which sounds ridiculous. I didn't go into being a lawyer thinking I wanted to run my own law firm at all. I sort of went into it thinking I'd be a public defender forever. I'm a first-generation college graduate, so first-generation lawyer. My father worked for the government. So I was sort of raised on this idea, like you get a government job and you stay there for 25 years and then you retire. So I went into the public defenders, again at the ripe old age of 24, 25, with that plan. So when I sort of switched courses eventually and left PD life, thanks to the support of mentors and things like that, I was surprised as I ventured down that path how much business and business development, how much time it takes. Lucky for me, I love that part of it. My husband and I own a brewery. I have a real estate business that I run, so I love business. So it isn't a bummer to me that I spend probably 25% of my week doing business development, doing those sort of things. But I think that's been the most surprising thing about running my own law firm.
Yeah, nobody talks about that and the logistics of managing all the information. And now you need all these operating systems to like run your client files.
Yeah, and part of that can be really fun, right? Like meeting with figuring out how to incorporate AI into my practice and, having all the right softwares and streamlining my work. I really love that, but it's non-billable time for the most part.
Right.
That you have to spend to build those processes and so that you can do your best work when you're working.
Yeah, I think that is one of the things that can make those government roles somewhat appealing, is there isn't as much of that. The government kind of runs everything for you.
100%. And I meet with public defenders all the time who say, I'm tired of the grind, the caseload, I want to make more money, whatever it is. And I remind them, I'm like, first of all, add, 20, 30K to your salary because of all of your benefits, your paid vacation, all of that. That's not to say, I love running my own firm, so I'm not trying to talk them out of it, but don't forget about that. And also don't just do if I build X number per hour, 8 hours a day, I would make X. Because if I'm billing 8 hours a day, I'm working 12.
Right.
And you know that from private law practice as well. So it takes a lot of time to bill time, and then add on top of that all the business stuff you get to do as a business owner.
Yeah, it's interesting. My parents both were government lawyers, and then my dad was a prosecutor for the government for most of his career, and then switched to a private criminal defense practice. And I think that was just an interesting point to even do that later in your career, because then, all of a sudden you're really used to paid time off and all of those benefits. And it was a little bit different because he'd had so many years with the government. I think the government still supported some of the benefits and things like that, but still there are like a lot of logistics. And one of the things that he always commented was that it's a different way of being on call when you have these individual clients. You don't just get to go home at 6, which he didn't always do if he was in trial, but generally speaking, you didn't have somebody calling you with an emergency. And so he used to keep a suit in the back of his car because he just never knew when he would be somewhere and would get a phone call and need to go to the jail or need to go have a meeting with someone, because it was just a much different dynamic.
Absolutely. My husband and I take a two-week to 20-day international trip every year. So I close my law firm. And it's so funny because every year, I go to the jail and I remind my clients for weeks, months leading up, like, I'm going to be completely unavailable for 20 days. By the time that last visit comes, they're like, just leave. We know, we'll be fine. Which is like, it's kind of my clients, because they're literally, their lives are on the line, but it's like, it's really hard to leave. And I have to set up with my paralegal, the people who call my office to hire me, you don't call a criminal defense attorney because you need help 3 months from now, right? So, I have to set it up that business goes elsewhere. And again, I really try to, run my firm from I try to not use a scarcity mindset with my firm, and understand that when I make time for myself, that I take the cases I want and say no to cases that don't suit me, the work I want to do is going to come back for me. Or if I say no to 5 cases while I'm in, Mexico for 20 days, when I get back, I'm going to be refreshed to do better work for the clients that I can take. So, I think it's hard when you run your own firm, because it feels like every call is money that you could make. But, not running a firm from a scarcity mindset is something I'm really have worked hard at.
Yeah, I think anytime you run your own business, to be able to just say, like, I'm out of office is really hard. And the longer you run your own business, I think it gets harder, because it becomes so much more a part of you. And you just don't clock in and clock out the same way. I think that I love running my own business because I think there are the trade-offs to that is you do have all this autonomy. You can decide what you want to do. You can build the life that you want. And you're very responsible for it. So, So, one of the things you mentioned when you were talking about your practice is you do juvenile defense. And so what are the unique challenges juvenile defendants face? And I feel like you don't necessarily hear a lot of law firms that focus on that or promote that they work with juveniles.
Yeah, it's so interesting. One of my mentors, when I was starting my firm, I went to her with sort of my logo and my website before it was all launched, and she gave me the advice to back off on the juvenile stuff. She's like, look, I think it makes you seem like you're less of a litigator. There has been, unfortunately, this sort of stereotype that people who practice juvenile law are less kind of fierce litigators because it's more of a soft system. I don't agree with any of that, but her advice, and I trust her, and she's still a dear friend and a mentor, was sort of back up off the juvenile stuff. That work will come to you because of your reputation doing that work. And I really stuck with my guns. And the reason I stuck with launching a law firm that says it's a juvenile-focused law firm is it's the work that I love to do. It's the clients that I love to assist. And really, it's a practice area and a specialty that's really been just sort of come to fruition, at least in Colorado, in the 16 years I've been practicing. When I started as a public defender, there were very few lawyers who were focused on representing children in a holistic manner, specifically children charged as adults. Those cases were just assigned to adult public defenders who represented adults because the child was in adult court. And it's really in those years that I was a public defender that the norm started to shift. And we started to say, we really need specialists to do this work who really understand the adolescent brain and development and the law specifically with children. So I think, it's been a joy of mine that's a focus of mine, and I still get plenty of criminal defense work in the door, but I get a lot of juvenile defense work. I'm in everywhere from Aspen to Colorado Springs, which is hundreds of miles away for those people who aren't Colorado people. Doing juvenile defense, which is what I love to do. So I think when I took maybe the risk of putting out that specialty and really putting out into the world what I want to do, that work came to me and people think of me for that work. So I really, really love it.
I would assume too that the challenge of juvenile work is that oftentimes you are really holding a community or a family around that juvenile who has, made possibly poor choices in extreme situations. I think that was one of the things that when my father changed careers, and people would say lots of things about prosecutors who switch.
Sure.
And, because I think a lot of prosecutors are true believers, right? They're just like, this, and my dad would say things like, I have a role to play. In my role, people make mistakes on my side. People make mistakes. We all do our best to keep the system as honest as we can. So when you switch sides, people would say all sorts of stuff, right? How can you do this? How can you defend? And he's like, most of my clients are people who made poor choices in extreme situations. And you're often holding the families who are supporting a person who made poor choices in extreme situations. And so I would assume in the juvenile court process, it's the same because you've got to have parents and family and community that are also really hurting and scared. And that's something they don't train you to do in law school, is manage families.
I don't even know that they train you in law school to manage clients.
I think that's true. Fair point. I was thinking that as I just said that. I was like, what class did we take that taught us to do that?
I think there's more of that now, at least at the law schools in Colorado. I'm seeing more of, interviewing with empathy and, people at least talking about those concepts. That is one of the hardest things about juvenile defense, and it's why for a lot of people it's not the right fit. Because you have a client, you owe your duty of loyalty to that client, you have your attorney-client privilege with that client, but then you have parents often who are paying you, or even if they're not paying you, they want to be apprised. Of course, the child is the holder of the privilege, so they can say, tell my mom nothing, tell my mom everything. Both of those conversations are hard for the lawyer, right? So managing the family is very hard. I will also say I represent a lot of lawyers' children. I swear your lawyer brain, I personally don't have children, but people who have children, it is like their lizard brain, like their brain does not work. People call me, well, I'm a lawyer, I sort of understand, my kid's in big trouble, and I think to myself, you actually probably know less than like the average Joe who calls me and their kid's in trouble because you know too much. So that part is hard, but I love that part, and I love looking at the whole, I practice holistic juvenile defense, and that's sort of best practices in Colorado these days. And so looking at really the whole child, the whole family, if it's available to me, to address the needs. Of course, I represent innocent children. There may be no needs, they're just wrongfully accused. But a lot of times I represent a child who in a split second, because their prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed, made a terrible decision, to your point. And the entire rest of their life could be changed in such detrimental ways. I'm representing children charged with homicide, sex assault, weapons charges. They're in really big trouble. And that's the hardest part about the work. It never gets easy to watch anyone go to prison. The the heartbreak of watching a child go to prison, and sometimes prison is the best option. If you can get a child a 20-year sentence to prison on a murder case, unfortunately, that might be considered a good sentence in some cases. And that's still longer than that child's lived, longer than the parents have had with the child in the home, right? None of those conversations are easy, but I really, really love it. I love it. And, I just try to keep empathy at the front of all of the conversations.
Yeah. I recently went and saw Malcolm Gladwell speak, how he has a new version of his book out. And one of the things he talked about in this lecture was the power of listening, because the interviewer was talking to him about like why he's good at what he does. And he says that he thinks his greatest skill is being a very acute listener, and that it's a very underrated skill, is being able to hold that. And I feel like that must be something that you really have had to hone when you're dealing with all of these folks who are in a crisis moment, as you said.
Absolutely. One of my tricks that I tell young public defenders, all lawyers, anyone who wants to be mentored by me, who is looking for a tip. Every time I meet with a client for the first time, I make sure it's an unending, that I don't have an appointment afterwards. So if I go to a jail at 1 p.m., I probably want to be home for dinner by 7, and I have never had to stay that long, but I don't come in and sort of say, I gotta be out of here by 3, because that starts off the conversation with this, like, I don't have enough time for whatever you want to tell me. I've found that when I don't say that, and I'm like, this is our first conversation, so I'm here as long as you need me, most of the time a meeting lasts for an hour. Everyone's exhausted after an hour. I'm gonna get out of there. But I'm holding space to have that conversation go as long as I need. Meetings moving forward, once I've built trust, I can say to someone, look, I have a doctor's appointment at 3, so I've only got an hour today. I hope that's okay. And everyone, they know I'm gonna listen, and I have listened in the past. And so that's something that really works well for me. I do it same with my office meetings. I will assume there'll be an hour, that first one, but if they're 2, I have the time on my calendar.
Yeah, because when you're trying to get somebody to confide in you, even if they've hired you, especially let's say in the juvenile context, right? Maybe it's the parents that have hired you, and this young person or this teenager does not know you. And so there's got to be time to convince them. I mean, teens aren't the best at speaking to you about things. Even my 10-year-old, sometimes it takes me a while to say like, all right, we're just going to kind of like noodle on this until you start, giving me actual information about what I need.
Absolutely. Everyone, when I have adults in my office, they all laugh because like my whole conference table is like covered in fidgets, which adults always laugh at them, but then they immediately start fidgeting. Right. Like we almost all love fidgets, right? But I also do a lot of walking meetings. Denver has a couple of great walking trails that are really private, or, kind of bike paths. If a young person, I'm talking to young people about the first time they had sex, or, really scary situations, they might not want to make eye contact with a 42-year-old woman or with anyone for that matter while they talk about it. So I really try to think outside the box about how to build rapport and how to, have those tough conversations, because you have to have that relationship in order to do my job well.
So how do you think that, if you're listening to this and you're in law school, and I think you want to do any sort of deep client-facing work, because I think that, criminal defense is its own category, but I would even assume that even family law lawyers would be in the same camp, right? You have people coming to you often in crisis, unless you're just doing prenup work, but there's usually a crisis. They're not at their best. They're in pain. Like, how should folks go about honing those skills? I mean, maybe law schools are talking to them about this more than when we were in law school, but still, like, law school is not as focused on being the whole person as maybe they should be. So, like, where do those skills come from? I mean, you have always been a good listener. I mean, we've known each other for a long time. I think that's part of who you are. But these are skills that can be developed.
Absolutely. I think, I don't even know if this is a piece of advice. I don't think I've ever been asked this question before, but I think one of the reasons I did to become a good listener is just to be curious in life. Don't stop reading novels and reading magazines and doing things that interest you when you're a law student. Don't just become like a law processing machine. That's not this job. For the most part, people hire me because of my empathetic listening, because of, my vibe, and like, the thing I say when they walk in, or when we're texting before the meeting or something. Like, people don't come in for the most part and start quizzing me about the law. I'm very good at the law. I know the law. People don't hire me having seen me ever cross-examine someone, right? They can read the reviews online, all of those things. They hire you because of your personality and your, your life experiences and your ability to make eye contact and to have those conversations. I also say that as I'm neurodiverse, I'm dyslexic. So I say that as like, I'm thinking about this from a neurodiversity perspective. I know some of us aren't as good at making eye contact or things, but think about the ways that you can connect to people, like what's best for you and is authentic to your personality. There is nothing about being a trial attorney that works if it's not your style. And I can't tell you how many, I've learned this the hard way by seeing people in the courtroom and trying to emulate something and then being like, I feel like an absolute idiot right now. Like, this is not me. This isn't something Hannah does, so it feels like I'm putting on an act, and I think a jury can tell that as well. And that's how it is with clients, whether it's a divorce or a civil rights case, someone's family member, a personal injury case. People are injured. They've lost a family member. They've lost their ability to use their body, feel well. You have to have so much empathy for that. And honestly, I think it's thinking more broadly than yourself generally is going to help unlock that. I also think, getting into those situations and watching other lawyers, address it when you have internships, asking, it might not be billable or whatever, but can I come to those meetings where you decide whether you take a client? And because a lot of the empathy starts, a lot of that rapport building starts in those initial meetings. I am so sorry this happened to you. One of the things I always say, which is 100% true when people call my office, I will say, how are you? Thanks for your call, how are you? And then I immediately say, although I know most people don't call my office on a great day, I'm glad to be talking to you. Because it's true, like, people don't call a criminal defense attorney because it's like, yay, a summons just pulled up in the mail, or there's a cop outside my door, right? Like, very rarely. So, I think think globally, read books, keep your personality outside being a lawyer, because I swear I don't get any of my business because of my lawyer skills up front, at least from a business perspective.
And I think look at other people even outside of the profession. I have a dear friend here in the Bay Area who is a chaplain. So she was trained in Zen Buddhism and decided she really felt called to become a chaplain. So she did a chaplain. So she did all this programming. She went to school for it. And she is the most intensive listener I have ever experienced. And this has been since I met her like a decade ago. But when Amanda sits with you to talk about we could be talking about poop and our kids, but like she is just there with you. She has this amazing presence, and you can see why she sits with people often in their darkest moments. She works with parents who their children are in a pediatric care and are in crisis, but you can see that she just has this ability to show up and hold space in a way that I've never seen before. And having her in my life has made me a better business owner. I mean, I talk to people who are in a different type of crisis, right? Not so extreme, but they might feel like they can't move forward in their profession. They are struggling. And I am able to hold those conversations better because I've had a friend in a totally different realm who's modeled for me what it feels like when somebody's really present. Like, she just has this deep presence. And so I think so often we forget to look outside the legal profession. Like you were saying, read books and do that. But like, what does it feel like to be around somebody who's such a good, compassionate listener? And then you want to take that and say, like, how do I do that even in my personal life when my friends are in crisis? How do I show up in that way?
I love that. It's such a good example. And I am lucky enough at this point in my career that I have sort of a board of directors of mentors. And I laugh because some of them, I don't necessarily tell them this, but like, I have the one that I'm like, I want her marriage when I'm her age. Right. She's a lawyer and she's an amazing lawyer and she also, but one of the core things I appreciate about her is how well she's kept her life outside of being a lawyer at her center. Then I have like the litigation. I have, like you, the empathetic, the lawyer that when I talk to her about a case or whatever, tears come to her eyes. Like she feels me with me, right? It's such an important lesson but, I'm maybe not going to come to that person for the business, development help because,
Right.
She's the one who's like, I work for a law firm because I'm a mess and I can't have my own business, right? So, I think you can't lean on one kind of example or mentor for everything. So you might have someone at your first job, for the listeners, that, you're like, wow, they run a client meeting so well, and then you see someone else, but then you see them litigate, and you're like, that would never be me in the courtroom. It's way too flashy, it's way too whatever. So that's fine. That person can be your client visit mentor in your head, and then you can borrow from someone who fits more your style for the courtroom presentation part of things. So I love that, and that friend of yours sounds amazing.
Wait, she really is. But you definitely have to have this board of directors. I love that. And I think as my life gets bigger and more complicated, I definitely have so many people I go to hold space for me in all sorts of different spaces. And it's such a treat when you get to be with those people who you look at for that individual advice, because you can say like, I'm here because I just want to like consume your advice on this topic, because like you're my person in this way. It makes those get-togethers really powerful, especially when nobody has a lot of free time. And so time becomes such a precious commodity.
I was just telling, I teach at both of the law schools here, as I said. We have this thing at University of Denver Law School. It's called Breaking Bread with the Professors. So the professors take the students out to lunch or coffee. I took my students out to pastries and coffee on a Saturday morning. And students sign up, and then you buy them coffee. And during that presentation, one of the things that the students were like, oh, this was so helpful to hear, was I said, as people's mentor and as a member of the legal community that people come to for advice, I am so appreciative when a mentee of mine comes to me and says, I would love to schedule a 15-minute phone call to talk about negotiating this contract that I just got this job offer, or 15 minutes to talk about my theme and theory in this DUI trial I have next week. I'm so much more excited to take that meeting than like a nebulous, can we schedule a call? Because when I go to plug, can we schedule a call into my Eisenhower decision-making matrix of like, how urgent is this? I have no idea. Is it life or death, or this can wait a month? So, and I just did it yesterday. I'm thinking of doing something sort of unorthodox in a case that I start in 8 days. And I texted 2 mentors, have you ever done X? Even yes or no, I would still like to schedule a call after the Thanksgiving holiday to talk to you about this trial of mine that starts on the 9th, to have any time between the 2nd and the 9th. They wrote back right away, thrilled to schedule the call because I was specific with my needs. So yeah, having those people you go to and being explicit with, right now I want to talk about this really hard case, or I want to talk about my stress about retirement savings, or whatever it is. I'm so happy to have that agenda. And of course, we're going to stray and talk about other things, but we're going to start. We're going to start with whatever the most pressing topic is for you, and that's how it should be.
Right. And I think that it really helps people understand how they can show up for you. Like, I think that so often, we have people in our lives and we know that we are their mentors or their friends, but it is nice to say, like, I need this. Can you show up for me in this way? And then as the person who's showing up, you're like, yeah, I can. I'm happy to show up for you in that way. And it's like such a benefit. Like you said, you can stray and have other conversations, but it feels good as the person who's giving that support to say, like, you have this need and I can help you meet this need right now. It makes you feel good and helpful. And then it also gets the kind of receiver of the advice what they need. They don't have to feel awkward, and you can even pre-think about it. I think that that's great too. Like, if you are like prepping for a case and want specific advice, maybe you don't want the off-the-cuff advice. Maybe you want the advice that they thought about on their commute into work, knowing they're going to have a meeting with you later. You couldn't do that if you didn't prep them for it.
100%. And that's the thing. When I get those, can I pick your brain later this afternoon? Sometimes I need to like pull a statute book out. It's like, if I had known ahead of time that you wanted to talk about 19.2.10.01, I would have looked at it before our call. So
yeah.
I think people think they're saving people time being vague, but actually, I think it's the opposite.
Yeah, I know. Let's just be as direct as possible. Life's too short.
100%.
And complicated.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, I know you and your husband are both entrepreneurs. You mentioned about your, vacation that you take internationally every year. I think it's so important to decide what balance means to everyone, because we cannot have everything at all times. It just doesn't work that way. So how have you set up your life so you feel that you have, what you want professionally and what you want outside of your life?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and I will admit, I think like many people probably from our generation of lawyers, this wasn't a focus when I first got out of law school. We did not talk about work-life balance. Now I speak on panels. The first question I get asked a lot of times from modern day law students is, what about work-life balance? I didn't think about that for the first 7 years of my practice, and it was to my detriment because I was burnt out. I wasn't doing anything well. And one of the reasons, I always tell this anecdote because I think it's so telling. One of the reasons I decided to leave the public defender is my husband, Brandon, said to me at my six and a half years as a public defender, he says, do you know you haven't texted me about something that wasn't work related in 6 months? And I was like, oh my gosh, please, like, that's gotta be. And like, please, in my head, I'm of course getting defensive because this sounds so bad. And so then I get on the bus, and I'll never forget, I get in the bus, and I'm like scrolling, and it's like, he's like, I love you, and I'm like, did you pick up my dry cleaning? Because I start trial on Monday. He's like, any plans this weekend? I'm like, closing murder on Monday. Like, just like, I was such, because my last 6 months as a public defender, I tried 2 murder trials and 4 sex assault trials. I was just litigating all of the time. So that was a real wake-up call for me, and I'm so glad he said something because at the end of this career, I plan to retire right at 60, so I will have been a lawyer for 35 years at that point. I'm going to have, hopefully, God willing, years and years and years of life ahead of me, and I want to have a partner and a life and friends and not just have my whole life around my law firm and my cases. Of course, my legal community, I love my legal community, but even my friends, I moved here, as you know, Lee, we went to school in California, so I moved here to Colorado to be a lawyer. So a lot of my friends when I first started were public defenders, were lawyers. It's been really important to me to diversify my friend groups, diversify what I'm spending time doing, and making, my family a priority. I'm also religious about the gym. I have to get to the gym 5 days a week. I just have seen firsthand how much better my brain works and lowers my stress. I make time I try to keep what I call a secular Shabbat, which is based in the Jewish traditions that I grew up with, that really more just, I don't work from sundown on Friday to Sunday morning, even when I'm really prepping a trial, because you're never at your best when you've worked 7 days a week.
No.
Sort of reminds me of taking the bar, right? Everybody said with the bar exam, take those a couple days before the bar off, don't study. And I remember it seemed so hard. And then when I was, almost done with the bar, it's like, wow, if I had been going for nonstop, I would have burnt out. Like there's only so much gas in the tank. So
it's so true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really impressive because you're teaching, you've got your solo practice, you have your other businesses, and then you also started a nonprofit.
I did. Although I'm transitioning, it has a new home starting January 1st.
Oh,
so
awesome!
After
That's
15
amazing.
years, that's sort of going off my plate a little bit. I'll still be involved, but yes, I co-founded, and have been the acting executive director for Lyric, which is Learn Your Rights in the Community. We started it 15 years ago. Myself and Michael Juba, he's another attorney here in town. And it's a Know Your Rights curriculum for young people. So it's meant to empower young people to be knowledgeable citizens about how the Constitution applies to them in police interactions. And that's for anyone who gets a speeding ticket, who hasn't been there, to, of course, folks who are investigated or part of larger allegations of criminal wrongdoing. To know, what does a lawyer say you should do in those situations, which is, remain silent, don't consent to them searching you or your stuff, and really putting yourself at the center of that and making sure you understand how your rights apply, and also talking about safety and acknowledging, generally the white supremacy in the history of policing in this country, and that there are just going to be certain young folks that we're teaching, especially that it's not safe for them to have police interactions. And so understanding how to safely exercise their rights is an imperative. So I love the work that we do. I will tell you though, I got burnt out of running having an unpaid extra job. And it started to feel like it wasn't going to be able to be sustained, and the message is so important that we decided it would go under the Transformative Justice Project, which is an amazing nonprofit in town. And I cannot wait to just go in and teach the curriculum instead of doing all of the back end things that I'm not as good at, like fundraising and all of those things. Although I'm sure I would still help with all of those things, but.
Sure, but it's different to own it than it is to help with it. It's a very different mental kind of capacity.
Yeah.
I think it's such a great message because as the daughter of two lawyers, of course, they had that talk with me, especially when I was a teenager, when I started going in my friends' cars, when I had friends in my car. I mean, I vividly remember sitting down and my parents being like, if you get pulled over, this is exactly what you do. Just remember, you do not know what's in anyone's backpack. You do not know what's in the trunk of the car. I mean, they, and they're like, if a police officer comes to your front door, like, this is what you say and do. And my dad was a prosecutor at that time. And he's still like, these are the things that you can do. And so even now, as my friends have teens, one of my friends, their teen was staying home kind of alone for the first weekend by himself. And I sat him down and was like, here's your, if you need to call the police for something, here's what's, going to happen. Or if you get, pulled over, whatever. And I think it's so important because who else is having these conversations with young people? Young people of color, of course, have such, there's such a greater impact on some of them because of the history of, racism around some of these interactions. The stakes are so high for everyone, but even more so for those populations. I think that being able to bring this discussion, and empower with information is so important. I really respect the fact that you've brought it into, and so you're doing it in schools? Are you teaching it in schools?
We do. We teach it in 50 Colorado schools, high schools. Yes. So
That's
the
so
ideal
cool.
situation is as going into a civics class after they've learned about the Constitution. But we teach in French classes and home ec, anyone who will have us, we'll be there to teach the lesson. So, teachers really love it. Students really love it. We, of course, have anecdotal evidence of I hear from lawyers, like, oh my gosh, my client remained silent because he pulled one of the business cards out. So it's really rewarding and important work. But I'm excited to go on to the next kind of volunteer thing, because at this point, Lyric has been about a 10-hour-a-week job for me on top of my job for, probably 10 years. For the first 5 years, we were pretty grassroots. It wasn't very organized. But now that we have a staff and, it's a lot. So, yeah.
Well, we could talk all day.
We could.
But, we both have things we have to do today.
Yes.
So before we go, though, I want to reminisce a little bit about our time in law school. So you talk about, 22-year-old Hannah, who's at law school and, wanted to take on kind of the prison establishment, changed course a little bit. So if you could go back and talk to, early 20s Hannah, what would you say to her and give her advice about what to do or how to think about the future?
I think I would talk to baby Hannah about networking and trying to network in an authentic way. I felt like such an imposter going into law school, and I surely felt like such an imposter anytime I talked to lawyers. And I will say, I don't know that you and I have talked about this, but the wildest thing about aging to me is how you don't change. Like, I thought I was good. 42-year-old Hannah would be so different from 22-year-old Hannah. And other than the life experience, I'm exactly the same. I'm going to crack up at the same weird thing. I'm going to feel awkward when I first walk into a room sometimes. And so you're talking to lawyers that also have their own insecurities and were in your shoes at some point. That's the cool thing about being a lawyer. We all went through some version of what you're going through. So I just wish I would have relaxed to feel myself and build community more with my mentors. I had a few, Richard Sakai, who was at our law school, who's one of my dear friends and mentors, and I credit with a lot of my success in law school. There were those people that I was able to put my guard down and be myself around. And I think I was good at that around my colleagues and our cohort. But when I went to a networking event, I was like I was like grown up. I was like 22-year-old Hannah pretending to be 42-year-old Hannah, even though she had it totally wrong, right? So, I think just relax, be yourself, ask those questions. I think the thing I got right about law school is I knew what I wanted to do. And so I was sort of like, I don't understand. I don't really understand contracts, and I'm going to study as hard as I can. I'm not going to break myself over it. And I got a C in contracts. And has there ever been a negative consequence in my life? Other than the fact when I sign contracts, I always think to myself, oh, maybe I should have gotten a C in contracts. It doesn't, I don't do that work. So, knowing that sort of that focus worked out well for me because I love what I do. But I wish I would have just been myself and admitted the things I didn't know, because I didn't know. I knew next to nothing. And I think the good news is, after about 5 years as a public defender, I matured a little, and I also kind of put my head out from under the water, and I was like, okay, I can do this. I no longer have the imposter syndrome that I started out with, but now I need to figure out how to do it better and learn from the people around me. So that's how I'd coach myself. But otherwise, I will say I did a lot of things right. We had fun. We didn't just study all the time, which I'm very thankful for. I meet some of these law students now that I'm working with, and I'm like, what are you doing this weekend? They're studying, and it's the first weekend of law school. And it's you need to go meet your friends, meet your cohorts, go to that barbecue. These are going to be your colleagues and your friends for life. And don't throw that away.
It's so true.
And they're going to be the people who help you. Sometimes it's well, I've got to get all of these for, okay, fine. But those friends are going to be the people who you call when you're I cannot understand mens rea or whatever. Explain it to me.
Right.
Or 20 years from now when you're this happened, I need your advice. So you really do need those people, both for your mental health and for your legal career.
Yeah, because life is happening while you're there. I think we can get into these pockets of time in life, and I feel like the one benefit you get from aging is you see time differently, right? That's one of the reasons why they say you get generally happier when you age, because you have a different perspective on time. But I, of course, think of that pocket of time, and I think of the fun we had and the people that we met. And yes, we did work hard, of course. But that's also life. Life was happening during that time, right? These are 3 years of your life if you're in it full time. And what do you want that to be? Yes, success. We both worked hard. We reached our goals, but it's still life. Life's happening right now, and you want to not miss out on it fully. You can be responsible and not miss out on it.
100%.
Yeah. Well, I like to end with one more question, because I think it's one that we don't ask a lot of lawyers. Is are you happy with this path? Are you happy with your profession and what you do?
I'm so happy. I have the best life. I just have really carved out a practice area that suits me. I do things how I want to do them. For example, I have a solo practice. I really didn't want to have business partners and deal with business partners, and I love working with younger law students. I have externs, but I didn't want to have associates and spend a lot of my time training folks. It's just not what I want to spend my time doing. And I've really stuck to that. And it makes me really happy, because I get to spend a lot of time doing the things I love, which is networking, business development, process development, and practicing law, meeting with clients, writing motions, preparing for trial. And I love that. And I have just a wonderful personal life, and Denver suits me, and I've really carved out a practice and a life that brings me a lot of joy. And I love being a lawyer. I tell my students every time I teach, I say to that, one of the things, you're taking a class from someone who loves being a lawyer. And we don't know, not everyone loves being a lawyer, but I really do.
Yeah. And I think that that's such a great conversation, because we can get down on the legal profession. That's a whole another podcast. And there are ways to build the life that you want. And I really respect that you have built a life around your passions, and with some balance, and leaning into the joy that you can find even when you're doing hard things, because the work that you do is not easy. But there can be joy in it too.
Yes, and I really recommend young law students, or not even just young, people new in their legal careers, think about sufficiency and what is enough. I really think we get sort of blindness when it comes to salaries. And, you see these, again, people are asking me to look at contracts, maybe not the best idea based on my contracts grade, but, people I've mentored who are getting these offers at Big Law, making money that I didn't make until I was 10, 12 years into my legal career. And I think, it does us all good to remember that there is enough money. And I say this knowing a lot of folks need to pay off loans and that life is expensive. But I think as a profession, people get golden handcuffs. And I will say that we had colleagues from law school that got golden handcuffs, and they're hard. It's hard to get the key and take that key back and kind of take control of your life. And it's hard to do, if you say, oh, I'm going to do this for 5 years and then I'm going to do, it's not easy to go and get a district attorney job after 5 years in big law. I see people try to do it all the time because there's a whole bunch of people who have done their whole career doing that. So just think about, what is enough for you. And I think a happy life is definitely something that's attainable for attorneys and for litigators, which I think can be even more elusive.
Yeah. Well, I so appreciate your time today. This was so much fun. We'll have to do it again. And we're taping this right before the Thanksgiving holiday. So have a wonderful holiday weekend with your family. And I hope to have you back soon.
Thanks, Lee. It was really a treat. Nice to talk to you.
If you enjoyed this video, please take a second to give us a like and leave a comment. And be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any future content. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com.